Hey guys, what is up? Kid here of Burn1 with the Shadowverse Evolved channel, as always bringing you another deck profile, this time on Fairy Forest. Paragons of the Colosseum just came out, which means we're in a new meta, and we have the Grand Showdown coming pretty soon in late September here. And Fairy Forest is one of the strongest, if not the strongest deck in the format. So this is definitely a deck you need to be hyper aware of. So let's get right into the deck. All right, so here's the deck itself. This specific list here is an amazing starting point if you're going to get into Fairy Forest, or if you're going to be testing into it. This is probably a standard, good, strong list to take and play against this list so you can understand how well your deck does against it. This was a top 8 list from Japan during the GP that time. It might have won the event too, I forget offhand, but this was the list I thought looked the most clean in the top 8, and so this is where I started off personally testing the deck, and I have made some changes since then, but this is definitely the best jumping off point for testing into the deck or playing the deck itself to figure out if you like the game style of this deck, because I think this is one of, like I said, the most cleanest list to be testing out in the beginning and then making changes from there. So we'll just jump right into the list. So Sakuna, an old favorite, if you remember this from the last meta and during mid-range forest and like combo forest stuff, this is a really powerful card. You kind of abuse it the same way in this deck as well. We only do a 2-1 split here because we're only looking to really combo off once with this card to get the combo 5, to get the 5/5 storm. A lot of times this will come out, it'll be like a 6/6 storm even, because we're still doing the same play patterns as we did before with Spinaria and the Wisp to set up really crazy boards when we go second with the Evo point. Card's amazing. Sometimes your turn 5 play, if you have the double Wisp Spinaria play and you build a board and your opponent can't answer it, it's still very, very scary for your opponent in general. Like, what can I say? An old card from set 1 that we threw away a long time ago. It is back now because there's actual support. Getting the fairy tokens into your EX era early on is very, very important. Any game you open Fairy Circle plus Fairy Dragon, you're probably going to have a really good time, especially if you've gone first in the matchup. But yeah, this is just how we kind of fuel our fairies early on. Then we can Amatage, buff them up, move them out, and then like give them storm. Otherwise, we can, once we buff them up a couple times, give them a couple +1/+1 counters, and paying 1 for a 3/3 or something onto the board when we just need to curve out our mana and maximize the mana usage, or play point usage, I should be saying. That this is one of the ways we do that, and we have other cards too that do benefit for having fairy tokens onto the board. So it's really important to be opening up that, or Spirit Shine. Often we refer to this card as worst Fairy Circle on turn 1, just because we just need the tokens in our EX zone as soon as possible to set up our turn 2 and 3 plays and so forth. So it's really important. Other than that, late game or mid-late game, this card becomes just a pay 1, gain 2 attack essentially for some of our followers, fairy tokens, to go ahead and push for extra damage at the cost of 1 play point when we have an extra play point or 2 sitting around and we have this spell in our hand. What's nice too, that Fairy Circle and this are spells, which means that we have way more hits for our Spinaria, so we're not always just losing our entire hand. Once we hit turn 5, we have a Spinaria turn set up, or even turn 6 or 7. That's how we kind of refill our hand in this and also find key pieces for combos there. Next, Nature's Guidance. In this version of Forest, we actually don't have a lot of bouncing stuff going on. I know if you've played the prior version of Forest, there are lots of interactions between bouncing your followers, bouncing animates back to your hand. That's gone here. We mostly use Nature's Guidance now as a combo extender. So there are plays where you'll like play Amatage onto the board, bounce it back to your hand, play Amatage again, and then bounce it back to your hand one more time, then play it a third time, then push up the fairies, go ahead and give them storm and push in for a ton of damage to buff up the board like that. There's a lot of really nice and cute plays you can do with Nature's Guidance, which is really important with this deck, and the fact that it replaces itself always feels good. So a little bit extra consistency as well. There are times where you can like Lily to the board, bounces back to your hand, and Lily again, which feels really good, because if you have a pretty bad hand, at least Lily does have targets in this deck other than itself to possibly add to your hand. But you can't always rely on that, unfortunately. But Nature's Guidance is just still a really, really good tool. It also helps extend our combo turns as well into the later games. Yeah. Amatage, this is what kind of like exemplifies how good fairies can be. I know fairies is often told as like the aggro deck of the format. Personally, I think it's a little bit less of an aggro deck and more of a tempo deck, where we're not looking to immediately like turn 2 shove up fairies or pixies or whatever and try to get damage in that way. What we're doing is we're kind of comboing off very slowly in the early game, while also presenting some very huge value targets for ourselves. And we're using Amatage as kind of our finisher and combo enabler. Like I said, you can bounce this back to your hand using Nature's Guidance, things like that. Push up the fairies, give them Storm, bounce back to hand, play it again, push up fairies, give those Storm as well. There's a lot of really cool play patterns with this card, and it's really obnoxious. And a lot of times when you play this card, if you don't have a way to save it or put it back into your hand or protect it, you're going to lose it next turn anyway, because if this lives on the board, giving 2 more fairy tokens Storm is like devastating for your opponent. If for some reason you play this on the board, push up some fairy tokens, and they let this live, you've probably won the game at that point. But yeah, this is just like the linchpin of the deck itself. If without this card, I don't think any of this other stuff is working. So it's very important that at some point, usually by turn 5 or 6, you want to find a copy of this to be in your hand. If you open up one early with Nature's Guidance, there are some plays that are really fun where you can play it out, bounce it back to your hand. It'll go ahead and build you a fairy token onto the board, and then you could tap it to give Storm and bounce it back to your hand. Do whatever you want from that. It's just such a powerful tool for the card, or sorry, for the deck, that is. But yeah, once you play with it, you'll understand how obnoxiously dumb this card can be. 2 of Archer here. This is kind of for like we don't have a lot of great tools to really deal with follower-centric boards all the time. If you look at the list, we're either like trading our followers in for value that way. Otherwise, we have to find an archer to be able to really push damage across the board. So whenever we play a pixie, we get some extra value, because when our pixies come in, they don't necessarily have the ability to use rush or anything like that unless we play something else to do that. So this is how we get some extra damage pokes in the early-ish games. Certain matchups like Disdain and stuff, it's really important to see this card as soon as possible and hopefully curve out onto it. Having 4 health is really hard for people to deal with, and we do play 1 of the Evo because there are situations where it's just better to be able to ping 2 things at once instead of 1, though it's not always needed. Archer has been like the worst card in the list, I feel like, just because it doesn't always come up where you need Archer, but when it does, it's very impactful. This is another card here, Blessed Fairy Dancer, that came in set 1 and no one really played, honestly. Maybe some people did play it because it was a decently statted 2-drop. But I know Force wasn't very popular in set 1, so I'm not sure how many people actually saw this card be played, but it's getting heavily played now because it adds to our, basically our ceiling for our deck, because there are, after you like Fairy Circle and then you say you don't open up Fairy Dragon, this is a very solid turn 2 play. It's still statted well enough that it's kind of annoying to remove on turn 2, but we're also getting anywhere from either like 3 or 2 +1/+1 counters onto our EX zone, which is really big. And then once again, it does combo very well with Nature's Guidance. There are plays where this lives on turn 2. Turn 3, I'll swing in with this Nature's Guidance, it back to my hand, and replay it after swinging in with it, just to buff up my pixies more, to get them into that buff state where my opponent might have to be worried of getting like 10 storm damage off of me pushing up 2 pixies and playing Amatage. Those turns are insane. And just every time you play one, it's also more and more like threatening your opponent. Like you have this aura of destruction behind you waiting to be unleashed, essentially. All right, next we have Crystalia Lily. We all know how powerful this card is. On play, we get a top check 2, and if there's a Crystallian or Pixie follower on there, you can add it to hand. We don't have a lot of hits for this card, but there are just like a couple in the deck, obviously. One of them being Blessed Fairy Dancer. But the main use of this card, as always, is removal, hard removal, so certain cards will just need to remove immediately. Also, the fact that it has 4 health and 2 attack generally in some cases feels okay, because we can like run this into something after evolving to clear something small out of the way while also getting rid of a big target. And then usually this lives with like 1, maybe 2 health, and then it has to be answered again, essentially. Otherwise, if you do end up getting the Nature's Guidance, you can bounce this back to your hand and then play it again, and evo hard remove something else as well. If you've been playing Forest, you know how powerful the card is. Next, Fairy Dragon here. If you have played this, this deck at all, so before you even seen this video, you know how busted Fairy Dragon is. Even in our set review, we gave this card like an SS plus or something ridiculous like that, just because of the power line this card just has. Anytime you open up Fairy Circle into Fairy Dragon and you have a 3/4 on board, it's such a hard card for your opponent to remove, especially if you don't ward it. And even if you do get this card removed on turn 2 for some reason, if it gets sent to the cemetery, it has last words. You get a Fairy Wisp and Fairy Token, which means that it's just fueling your entire game plan on top of being high value. This coming down as a 3/4 on turn 2 is insane, and it's quite annoying for a lot of decks to deal with. There's not many decks that can really deal with it on their turn 2, especially if you go first. Once you play with this card, you'll understand how obnoxious it is. This card is just that good. Next, we have Rhinoceros. Once again, another card from set 1 that obviously saw a lot of play in set 1, but since then kind of fell off. This card is really, really great in this. I know there's some lists running around that people have been testing right now that have like Sansazuka and stuff. I like Sansazuka a lot, but I think in this type of deck, we need a low to the ground card that can also double as like hard removal. Unlike Sansazuka, this can just answer 2 things on the board when it gets like too wide for us to deal with. But what's really nice about this card, it also plays into our game plan because of the Evo side of the card. We can either give it Storm or deal damage to an enemy follower based on its attack. And there are plays where you'll literally push up 4 pixies from your EX zone, and then you'll just play this down to go ahead and make this a 5 attack Storm follower to close out games. It's obnoxious in that sense. There are some times too where I think I've gotten this upwards of like 7 damage or so, depending on like what my hand looks like and what I'm doing that turn with like the pixies and the fairy circles and stuff like that. All right, moving on to Elf Song here. Elf Song is an insane card. If you've obviously been playing since last set, you know how powerful this can be. We play as a 3 of because our board does get wide with a lot of pixies and a lot of little tokens that come out. And turns after doing the Spinaria, like turn 5 and plus turn, where we top deck, we can grab this off of there, go ahead and Elf Song with also a Sukuna on the board, making a 6/6 Stormfaller. Insane value. This is just very good in the general game plan of the deck. It does what it wants us to do. Like it just works so well into the game plan. I don't see a reason to cut this down any more than 3. I like it at 3. I could see it being cut down to 2 if you want to like fit some tech cards in. But seeing this off of seeing this off of Spinaria is very big and game warping essentially. Sometimes that extra health and extra attack is sometimes more than enough to push you over the edge. Once again, Elven Princess Mage is back. We do play 2 of the Evo. This is kind of our turn 3, turn 4 play where this can set up our Spinaria turns. Also the fact that we get 2 Fairy Wisp tokens that also can get bumped up by power in the deck, as well as being free 0 costed followers, meaning that we can spend more play points into powering them up on the same turn we're playing the Amatage turn, where we play this down, they get the +1/+1. Maybe we, instead of spending an extra 2 play points to push up 2 pixie followers, now we're playing 2 play points to go ahead and, like, for example, use Spirit Shine to buff them up even more and also create a bigger combo count if we want for anything later, like Rhinoceros, for example. Just the extra reach those Wisp had in the deck, along with the fact that it combos so well with Spinaria on turn 5. It's just so hard not to have this card in the deck. It's just such good value, and the fact that it's the way it fuels the deck, also fueling Spinaria, which helps with fueling yourself as well. It just feels so good in the list. I could never not see this as a 3 of, because I think seeing this early, especially being able to curve this out on turn 3 or 4, is so huge, because setting up a Spinaria turn or threatening a turn 5 Spinaria turn is really big for you, because if you're in a matchup where they don't have very good removal tools for a huge wide board, sometimes that's all you really need to win the game, especially when you go first. Rose Gardner, I know this card comes in and out of the meta all the time. It's back once again because we do combo fairly easily, meaning we can get the combo 3 off here, which lets us draw a card pretty often. But don't get stuck in your head that you have to combo 3 to play this card. We're using this card as a tempo card to just put our opponent behind, especially when we go second. We need to be using those Evo points. Just essentially time walking our opponent by removing their one big thing they played their like turn 3 turn or whatever, is pretty big. The fact it's a 4/4/2, letting us answer something else as well. I've been in a lot of scenarios where like Lily or Rose Gardner are like the two big things I need to see on turn 3 or 4, especially going second to stay in the game if my opponent is going very wide very quickly, and usually that's more than enough to usually close out the game from there. And like you get the extra bonus if you randomly get a draw card occasionally if you are set up to do that. Finally, the last most expensive card in the list, Spinaria. It's a 5-drop. We're playing such little followers that only cost like 1 here and there, and a lot of followers too that cost 0 when we do get wisp, means that we're going to get combo 3 fairly easy and fairly early with this deck. That's why turn 5 Spinaria is still happening fairly often in your games, which means you just should be running 3 of this. Also, we play more spells in this list and a lot of followers that we need to see to combo off, so this helps us dig for those pieces. A lot of like the quote-unquote skill testing of this deck is going to come down to 2 instances in my opinion. One is how you use Spinaria and what cards you pick off of Spinaria. Sometimes it's very clear what you need to pick, other times it might be a little bit cloudy and murky and you have to like figure out exactly where you're at in the game, what your opponent's doing, and then pick the perfect 2 cards there. And then, like I said, other times it's just like straight up like, oh, it's obviously Elf Song and Sakuna because I can just combo this turn and push 6 face damage immediately. The other part about this deck I do think is your opening hand, mulliganing your hand, and also figuring out whether your hand is made to be more aggressive or being more mid-rangey in that sense, because I think that's the point. When the first couple turns, when you figure out what type of hand and what type of opening you have, that's how you decide what lines you play. Sometimes you do play the hyper aggressive lines where you're just like Fairy Circle, Fairy Dragon, and Amatage, bounce back to hand, push up the wisp, whatever. Those games are very straightforward and you usually win those games by turn 5 anyway. But figuring out that your hand has the gas to do that and your opponent isn't going to have answers to deal with that quick enough, and if you know they're going to have answers, then you got to play for the mid to late game. If you play for the mid to late game, sometimes it gets rough, especially if you don't have ways to hyper buff your pixies and getting up to like 5+ swings. There have been games where I've had to play a slightly longer game just because I knew if I try to go the hyper aggro route early on, I was just going to peter out and not have gas. And then I kind of had to wait till like turn 7 or 8, which is very scary for this deck because a lot of times around that range is when like the Kuon deck will just win the game anyway. But getting to turn 7 and turn 8 and then being able to use Spinaria and have that really good mid-range and set up the board where that turn I'm pushing up Amatage along with like a couple pixies that are like 5+ power and just swinging in for 10 damage that turn to kind of close out the game that way after chipping them a little bit here and there with some other things along the way. Figuring out that is very, very important for the deck and like how quote-unquote skillful you are. But sometimes honestly you open up the nuts and you sit there and your opponent just loses the game because you won the die roll. But yeah, I really love this deck. I think if you are going to the Ground Showdown and you're trying to win or top 8 that event, you have to know how this deck works inside and out so you understand their lines and their, how much reach they actually have on their kill turns essentially. There are times where we found accidental lethal when testing the first time just based on like Renata Roach with Spinaria coming out, buffing things, playing Rhino Roach, and then just evoing it, and I'm like, oh, actually we're swinging in for 7 here. That's actually game, percent handshake, and we're like, wow, that was like kind of felt like it came out of nowhere because we got like Renata Roach off of like Spinaria and things like that, which feels insane. But yeah, that's the deck itself. If you are looking to get into this deck, this is the list I think you should start with before you make changes and figuring out what you want to do with your game plan, whether you want to be more mid-range, whether you want to be more aggro or control-y, whatever you want. But I think this is the perfect list to start experimenting with pixies and figuring out what works for you and what doesn't. Hopefully you guys like this deck profile, and I've hopefully taught you enough about this deck right now that you can kind of jump into it without really thinking too much and just go at it. But thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below, what are you doing with this deck list? What pixie things, what techs have you guys come up with? Because I'm very, very interested, because this is a list I might be taking to Showdown. Not this exact list, but this strategy is the what I'm kind of leaning towards right now in my testing, because this felt like it had the least bad matchups out of all the decks. I don't think this deck also like doesn't necessarily have the best long game plan. I think if you're looking for a longer game plan, you just play the Kuon list, honestly. But if you like this type of strategy, which I'm kind of leaning towards, I really think this is where you need to start and so forth. But yeah, let me know what you guys are doing, and maybe we can trade some ideas. If not, join my Discord server below, the Burn One Discord server. It should be in the About section or the description section there. We should have a link there. Let us know what you are doing. We can talk in Discord and brew on this list and figure out what's needed, what's not, and go from there. Other than that, guys, thanks for watching. I hope to see you guys in the next video. Later, everyone.